The Steam Deck OLED 1TB model has just seen a huge price increase in the United States, jumping from $649 to $949, while the 512GB model has gone up by $240. These are not small increases, and completely change the value argument around the Steam Deck, especially when we're talking about a handheld built around an older APU that first launched with the original Steam Deck back in 2022. For over 4 years, I've been playing the Steam Deck and recommending it to others, and I've always believed it continued to beat other handhelds year after year because of its affordable price, support, its always improving Steam operating system, SteamOS, the community, and the ability to just pick it up and play seamlessly. This made it an incredibly attractive option for consumers and easy to recommend. But on May 27th, 2026, Valve officially announced that they had increased prices due to rising memory and storage costs. And after seeing this, I honestly can no longer recommend the Steam Deck OLED in the same way anymore. At $789 for the 512GB model and $949 for the 1TB model, Valve has moved the Steam Deck OLED away from the affordable price bracket that made it so easy to recommend, as this restock announcement and price rise has put a major dent in the Steam Deck's reputation as the best value handheld. And beyond the deck itself, it raises serious questions about the wider Steam hardware ecosystem, the Steam machine, and whether an eventual Steam Deck 2 can still be the affordable upgrade people were hoping for over the next few years. And while Valve may have genuine reasons for raising the price, that does not automatically make the product a good purchase. There is a point where the explanation behind the price becomes secondary, because the buyer is left with one simple question before spending their money. Does this still offer enough value compared to everything else available on the market? And at $789 and $949, I think the answer becomes very clear. The Steam Deck OLED has not changed, but the price around it has. And once you reach this level, a lot of people are simply going to compare it against other handhelds, consoles, refurbished devices, and second-hand options instead. The Steam Deck OLED is not a bad handheld by any means. In fact, it is still one of my favourite handhelds ever made. But Valve has moved the OLED model away from the affordable sweet spot that made it so easy to recommend in the first place. And by doing that, they have not just hurt the Steam Deck OLED, they have hurt confidence in Valve hardware moving forward. Because if this is where pricing is going, people are naturally going to ask what the next Steam device is going to cost. Back in late 2025, Valve announced the Steam Machine, Steam Frame, and Steam Controller for an early 2026 release, but they did not attach prices to any of them. Now, over 6 months later, we've had not much communication, and suddenly the Steam Deck OLED is pushing nearly $1,000. So what does that mean for the Steam Machine? And what does that mean for a Steam Deck 2? And are we now heading into a future where Valve hardware is no longer the affordable, value-focused option people expected it to be? That's what worries me the most, because the Steam Deck mattered, and it was one of the few modern gaming devices that still felt like a solid, affordable handheld PC, which lets us play games locally. It's got desktop mode, mods, emulation, offline play, expandable storage, and control over what we do with the hardware we own. But this price increase makes that kind of device harder to access, while the wider industry keeps pushing everyone toward cloud services, subscriptions, streaming, and thin client devices that are often cheaper up front but far worse long term. And at these new prices, the real question is no longer, is the Steam Deck OLED a good handheld to buy? But what else can we buy between $400 and $1,000 that delivers a comparable or better portable gaming experience? And at $499, the Switch 2 is now an even easier recommendation for a lot of people. Yes, Nintendo games are usually more expensive physically and digitally compared to Steam sales, and we are locked down inside the Nintendo operating system. But for the average consumer, the Switch 2 provides simplicity and makes the most sense for the price. You buy the game, download it, put the cartridge in, and most of the time you get a ready-made handheld experience from day one without having to mess around with settings, Proton versions, launch commands, upscalers, frame generation, Steam Deck verified system, or compatibility issues. And later this year, Nintendo is reportedly raising the Switch 2 price by $50, while also planning to increase production to around 20 million units, showing confidence in the demand, upcoming games, and the system's long-term momentum and adoption rate, despite higher market costs. And in its first year, we're already seeing much stronger third-party support than the original Switch had at launch, with games like Cyberpunk, Indiana Jones, Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, Assassin's Creed Shadows, and soon Elden Ring, with plenty more either released or on the way. So while the Switch 2 is not the same kind of device as the Steam Deck, at this new price point, it absolutely becomes even more part of the conversation. Because if someone just wants a reliable handheld gaming device for modern games, Nintendo Switch 2 looks like one of the more sensible mainstream options. The second option is the second-hand handheld PC market. On places like eBay, Marketplace and second-hand retailers, we can find devices like the ROG Ally Z1 Extreme or Lenovo Legion Go Z1 Extreme for far less than the new Steam Deck OLED price. And with those devices, you get better performance, but you have two choices. You can use Windows 11 and get better compatibility with Game Pass, launchers and anti-cheat games like Fortnite and Call of Duty, or if you prefer the Steam Deck style experience, we can wipe Windows and install SteamOS, or a SteamOS-like alternative like Bazzite or CachyOS, and end up with a faster handheld experience than the Steam Deck. But of course the trade-off with these is the battery life is usually worse, but you can buy external battery packs or play plugged in more often. Windows can be messier and you lose the Steam Deck's trackpads, which, in my opinion, for a lot of people, the trackpads were mostly useful for strategy or mouse-heavy games, navigating desktop mode a bit easier, or other niche operations and functionality. They're nice to have, but they are not worth hundreds of dollars extra by themselves. And when the Steam Deck OLED is now priced like a premium handheld with the current performance output, these second-hand Z1 Extreme devices suddenly become much more attractive options. The third option is buying a refurbished or second-hand Steam Deck LCD. Valve's own refurbished LCD models, when they're in stock, have previously been available around $319 to $359 in the United States. And through eBay, Marketplace or second-hand resellers, you can often find Steam Deck LCD models around $300 to $500, depending on storage, condition and accessories. Sure, you don't get the OLED screen, improved battery life, or Wi-Fi 6E chip, and you don't get the smaller improvements Valve made with the OLED refresh, but you still get the core Steam Deck experience. You still get SteamOS, desktop mode, emulation, modding, community support, and the same compatibility profiles that made the Steam Deck so popular in the first place. And I still have my day one Steam Deck LCD after 4 years. I've taken it apart multiple times, tested thousands of games on it, and it still works exactly as it did when I bought it. And in my opinion, Valve hardware has always been built to last, and that makes a cheaper LCD model a much more sensible option than spending nearly $1,000 on the OLED. But the fourth option, and probably the strongest, most competitive, direct alternative for someone looking for a more premium experience that offers better performance than the Steam Deck, is the ROG Xbox Ally X. In the United States, this retails at around $999, which is only $50 more than the new Steam Deck OLED 1TB price. And fingers crossed that over the next few weeks and months, this doesn't receive another price hike. As for the extra $50, you are getting a much more recent APU and modern handheld. You get the Ryzen AI Z2 Extreme APU, 24GB of RAM, a 1TB SSD, and an 80Wh battery. Windows 11, Xbox mode, better compatibility with anti-cheat games, and access to things like Game Pass, Fortnite, Call of Duty. And this is where the comparison starts to look really bad for Valve, because at roughly the same price point, the ROG Xbox Ally X gives you newer hardware, more RAM, better game experiences, a much bigger battery, and stronger performance potential overall. And over the past month, with mine, I fitted a bigger drive, installed SteamOS on it, and now I can get an experience that feels incredibly close to the Steam Deck, but it's got much stronger hardware behind it, so newer games like Crimson Desert just perform way better, easier to run, and a lot more playable. So at $949, the Steam Deck OLED is no longer sitting comfortably in its own category. It now has to compete even more against the Switch 2, refurbished LCD Steam Decks, second-hand Z1 Extreme handhelds, the ROG Xbox Ally X, and the next wave of premium flagship handhelds from Asus, MSI and Lenovo. And that's really the main problem, because the Steam Deck OLED is still a brilliant handheld, but at these prices it is no longer the obvious value choice. It now positions itself more like a premium handheld without the newer premium hardware to match. Valve's official reason for this price increase is rising memory and storage costs. AI data centers, cloud providers, server companies and big tech are buying huge amounts of memory, storage, GPUs and infrastructure, and that demand is putting pressure on the same supply chains that feed consumer devices like handhelds, laptops, phones and PCs. So yeah, there is a real world reason why RAM and SSD prices are becoming more expensive. But I also think this is where we need to separate two things. There is a reason why prices are going up, and then there is the question of whether the final product still makes sense for the consumer. Because at the end of the day, most people buying a gaming handheld are not thinking about NAND pricing, DRAM supply, data center demand, wafers, tariffs, or long-term component contracts. They are looking at the price, looking at the alternatives, and asking one simple question: is this worth my money? And this is where I think Valve has a serious problem, because if the future of consumer technology is higher prices, cloud dependency, subscriptions, and more expensive local hardware, then affordability becomes even more important, not less. Devices like the Steam Deck matter because they give us a real local gaming machine. They've always given us a feeling of ownership through the attachment of our Steam accounts and the libraries they have, offline play, storage, mods, emulation, and control. But if those devices start moving closer to $1,000, then the future becomes harder for normal consumers to access, and we move towards a world where cloud devices and subscriptions start to become the affordable options for daily entertainment. So yeah, I understand that the market has changed, I understand that memory and storage costs are a real problem, but from the consumer side, the result is still the same. The Steam Deck OLED is now much more expensive, the hardware has not changed, and people are going to look at other options that make more sense for their money. And that is the part that I think makes it frustrating for a lot of us, because the problem is not that the Steam Deck OLED suddenly became a bad handheld, as SteamOS, community support, and the overall console-like experience are still huge strengths, and some of the many reasons I've supported the Steam Deck for so long. But the price has moved, and the performance has stayed exactly the same. These are the kind of prices I would have expected to see from a Steam Deck 2, with newer hardware, better performance, more RAM, and a genuine generational leap. Not the same device refresh we already had. And while the OLED model is nice and still has a place for people who specifically want the cleanest SteamOS handheld experience out of the box, at $789 and $949, it just becomes pretty much impossible to recommend. So I am interested to know what you all think about the Steam Deck price rise. Would you still buy one at this price, or do you have other options in mind? It would be great to know your thoughts, and if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, please give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share with others. Until next time, have a wonderful day, thank you for your time, look out for one another, and I'll see you later.